In this final segment of Lecture 22, we're going to focus on prejudice. First, we need some terms that'll help us understand prejudice. There's a concept of in-group, out-group membership. Your in-groups are typically defined by people who have similarities to you. You can have a lot of different in-groups. You could have an in-group that's defined by your religion. You could have an in-group that's defined by your race, ethnicity. You could have an in-group that's defined by the college you attend, or the neighborhood that you live in, or your gender, your sexual orientation. All of these things can be a basis for in-group. It's people like us. Sometimes you'll hear people use the phrase, my tribe. This is my tribe. These are my people. That's in-group. Now, what's an out-group? An out-group is anybody who's not in your in-group. So it's people who are different from you in some ways. And they can differ from you in religion, race, ethnicity, gender, education, employment status, a phenomenon that causes a lot of problems. And that's called the in-group bias. We tend to favor or prefer people who are in our in-group more than people in our out-group. We like people in our in-group and tend to dislike people who are not in our in-group. In-group bias. And again, this occurs even if groups are established randomly. Prejudice. What is prejudice? Prejudice is one of those words where if you look at it, you get the definition. So the first part of the word is pre, which means before, and judice is judgment. Prejudgments. In other words, when you judge people before you actually know anything about them. Prejudgment. You don't wait to collect data, you just make a judgment before you have any information. And prejudice is when we have usually a negative reaction or feeling about people from other groups, people in an out-group. So prejudice is found when we ask people how they feel about people who are not in their in-group. Usually the out-groups are defined again by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, language, gender, economics, neighborhoods. So prejudice is when we have negative thoughts about people who differ from us. Okay, what are the components of prejudice? Stereotypes and discrimination. Stereotypes are your beliefs. Discrimination is your actions. And we're going to talk about examples of both in this segment. Now, conscious stereotypes are on the decline. If you ask people today how they feel about other groups of people, they're a lot less likely to say now that other groups of people based on their gender or their race or ethnicity or their religion are awful. These are conscious stereotypes, conscious beliefs. So for example, if we go back to the 1940s and you asked people in the 1940s, and these are actual data, in the 1940s, would you vote for a woman president? 70% of people would tell you, no, I would never vote for a woman candidate for president. I don't care how qualified she is. I am always going to feel more comfortable with a male president. Now, if you ask people that question in the 1995, only 10% of people would say, no, I'm never going to vote for a woman president. This is what people say. If you ask people whether whites should be able to tell people of color that they can't live in their neighborhood, I know that's probably shocking to you, but there was a time, even in the San Fernando Valley, where certain communities did not allow people of color to buy a house. Illegal to sell a house to a person of color. For example, the town of Tarzana. For many years, Tarzana had on the books a rule that said it's illegal to sell your house or apartment to a person of color. All right, so if you ask folks back in the 1970s, when this law was on the books in Tarzana, whether whites have the right to keep minorities out of their neighborhood, About 60% of people would tell you, yeah, absolutely. But if you ask that question 25 years later, say in 1995, only 10% of people would say, yeah, whites have the right to keep people of color out of their neighborhood. So these conscious stereotypes do change. Interracial dating was not okay for the vast majority of US history. But thank God it's changing, and it's changing dramatically. So if you went back to, well, not that long ago, let's say 1990, so 30 years ago, and you asked somebody born before 1928, 60% of them would tell you that interracial dating is not okay. If you ask baby boomers that same question in 1990, only 40% of them would say that interracial dating is not okay. Still, you're thinking, my God, 40%? Wait. If you ask that question of Generation X or Generation Y, you ask them in 2009, of course interracial dating is fine. So, conscious prejudice, conscious stereotypes do and can change dramatically, but not all of them. Some stereotypes change more quickly than others. So, for example, attitudes about gay marriage have not evolved all that quickly, at least not as quickly as interracial marriage questions. Muslims in the US face tremendous discrimination ever since 9/11, and that hasn't improved very much. Women are still discriminated against at the size of their paychecks and their opportunities in the workforce, and as we know, in elections. Now, here's the thing about conscious prejudice. People will tell you that they are not prejudiced against another group of people, when in fact they are. They just don't know it. So you can hold one set of beliefs consciously in your conscious awareness, but have a totally different set of beliefs unconsciously. You can hold unconscious stereotypes that are still highly discriminatory. So let me give you an example. Think about the last few years, the number of people of color who have been shot and killed by police officers who believed they saw a gun in that person's hand. Here's a study that'll just turn your stomach. They presented to people rapidly flashed pictures, and in between those rapidly flashed pictures, they had people make judgments about whether something was a weapon, a gun, or a tool. So you see here a wrench, the right answer would be tool. But if before people see the wrench, you briefly flash a picture of an African American man, and then immediately afterwards you ask them to make a speeded judgment about whether this is a gun or a tool, there's a really big bias. If white participants have just seen an African American man's face, then they're much more likely to judge or to see a wrench as a gun. When you think about that, the number of African American men who've been killed by people who thought they had a gun or were threatening when in fact all they had in their hand was, say, a cell phone, this is evidence that that really happens in the laboratory and in the real world, and it's a function of implicit, unconscious racism. The lab that my students are going to participate in for this unit involves them taking a really cool test of unconscious bias, unconscious stereotypes, called the implicit association test. Implicit just means unconscious. And it's a test of how quickly you can learn to associate different things together. For example, let's say that I hate eggplant and I love broccoli. If you ask me to associate eggplant, which I hate, with words like delicious, desired, I'm going to have a hard time learning that association because it conflicts with my internal beliefs about eggplant and broccoli. Broccoli that I love, however, would be very easy for me to learn to associate with words like delicious and desired. But what if you do that with groups of people? How quickly do you associate pictures of African Americans with words like great, trustworthy, hardworking, friendly? And how quickly can you associate those same words, friendly, hardworking, with white faces? The great thing about Harvard University's IAT test is you get to pick what stereotype or group of people you want to test yourself on. When you look at the millions of responses, what sort of unconscious biases do you find? 88% of white participants hold either pro-white or anti-African American biases. Let me say that again. Nearly 90% of whites, by these unconscious measures, hold racist beliefs. They think that either whites are great or African Americans are bad. Now, if you ask them what they think, if you ask whites what they think about African Americans, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm just the same. But if you measure them unconsciously, their unconscious bias with this IAT, you'll find that about 90% of whites are biased against African Americans. How about discrimination against gays and lesbians? Well, 83% of heterosexual participants hold either a pro-straight or anti-gay belief. If you look at participants who are not Arabs and they're not Muslims, it turns out that 2/3 of them hold strong anti-Arab Muslim beliefs. So there's a really big difference between biases and stereotypes measured at the conscious level and measured at the unconscious level. Prejudice is alive and well. It's just underground now. It's just unconscious. And that's what we learned from the implicit association tasks. But you might be saying, maybe the implicit association task isn't very good. Maybe that's why it measures so much more bias than conscious measures. Maybe it's the test that isn't any good. Well, the results of the IAT have unfortunately been confirmed under real-world conditions. In the first study I'm going to tell you about, which was conducted in the US, fake resumes were sent out to well over 1,000 major employers who had placed help wanted ads online. There were two types of resumes. There was one resume that was very average. The other half of the resumes were excellent. Someone who had lots of education and training that was perfectly consistent with the job that was being advertised. So you had an average resume and a really good resume. Now, what was the manipulation? Half of the average essays, the name on the resume, was either stereotypically white or stereotypically African American. So what do I mean by that? We'll take the same resume and put the name at the top of the resume as Greg or Brad, stereotypically white names, or keep exactly the same resume, but change the name at the top so it has a name that is primarily associated with African Americans, like Tyrone or Tamika. Would you imagine that employers would treat those two resumes differently just based on the first name? The experimenters also did the same thing with the excellent resume. Half of those went out with a stereotypical white name, Brad, and the other half of them went out with a stereotypical African American name, Tyrone. What the researchers wanted to see is how many of the different types of resumes, how many times did employers reach out to follow up and get more information about the person? Well, here's the ugly truth. Resumes with white-sounding names got 50% more interest, more callbacks than resumes, the same resume, with a black-sounding name. 50%. Just because your name Your first name makes it sound like you're either white or black, and it gets worse from there. For African Americans, it didn't matter how qualified you were for the job. Conversely, when folks had stereotypically white names, there were a lot more callbacks for the qualified applicants than for the average resume applicants. And the final kick in the teeth for African Americans, let's compare employer interest for average applications that have white names. Compare that to resumes, applications that come from highly skilled, highly educated people with African American names. Which group do you think got more callbacks? The average white applications got more callbacks, generated more employer interest than the excellent, skilled applications with an African American's name. Prejudice is alive and well. That was America. How about in other countries? Maybe our situation is worse than other countries. Well, a similar study was run in France. And in France, the outgroup, the group that gets discriminated against, are people with Arabic-sounding names. They did a streamlined version. There was one application, and either that application went out with a name at the top of the resume that sounded French, as in francophone, like Jean-Claude Bonnet, or it had a name on the top that made the person sound like they were from an Arabic background, an Arab-sounding name. What happened in France? If a resume had a French francophone name on it, then it was 30% likely to get an interview from the employer. If exactly the same resume was sent out, but instead of having a French francophone sounding name on it, it had an Arab sounding name on it, only 5% of those resumes resulted in an employer asking for an interview. In other words, in France, white French applicants to jobs are 6 times, not 6%, 6 times, so 600% more likely to get an interview than identical resumes with Arab-sounding names. That is prejudice. What determines whether or not people express prejudice? Well, there's a phenomenon called scapegoat theory. And scapegoat theory says that when bad things happen, you attribute them to some outgroup. So, for example, when the economy in the U.S. isn't doing very well, how do we explain that? Well, we pick a scapegoat. We blame it on immigrants. The fact of the matter is, there's enormous evidence to show that immigrants make our country economically stronger. Their spending money creates more jobs for everybody. So scapegoating them is not logical, but that's what we do. Prejudice has also been linked to fear, even at the neural level. Do you remember when we talked about a part of the brain called the amygdala? Its job is to process fear. When people have an amygdala that's relatively quiet, when people are not feeling fear, they're unlikely to hold prejudiced beliefs. When people are fearful, they are much more likely to hold prejudiced beliefs. There's another cause of prejudice, and that is frustration. There's a theory called frustration aggression theory, and it says that if a person is frustrated, then they're going to find someone to blame for their situation and then act aggressively towards that person. To manage your frustration at your situation in the world, what do? You discriminate against members of an outgroup. And you can see that so much in the U.S. these days. When folks are not frustrated, when they feel respected, loved, supported, they are much less likely to hold prejudiced beliefs or to discriminate against other people. Kind of depressing, but that's where we're going to end this segment on prejudice. Students, take some time with that IAT lab. It can change your life. Thanks.